everyone, and welcome back to the show,
Highlights of Life!
Today's episode is U.S. history, 12 minutes before the world ends. Because as you can see, the world is coming to an end soon. And we are going to go over important questions in the last century and a half. We really appreciate how far we have gone, and it's so sad to see it all losing 12 minutes. So, I'm going to start off with... Oh, wait, I'm joined by a special guest with...
Crystal on economic policy.
Drew on foreign policy.
Naira on domestic policy.
And your host, Paulina, with diverse identities and groups. So, Crystal, would you like to start us off with the Gilded Age?
Yeah. So actually, over the course of the last century, the government has basically been more and more active in economics through like these fluctuating periods of less regulation and more regulation. So back in the Gilded Age, business was mostly unregulated, and government allowed corporations to form without charters, unlike before. And because of these loose regulations, businesses adopted smart tactics like kind of negotiating rebates with their supply companies and vertical and horizontal integration. So the former was taking over businesses that you depend on for resources, and the latter is like eating out your competition and basically causing almost becoming a monopoly. That happened in multiple instances. That almost happened in multiple instances. And in fear of monopolies, the government tried to regulate this by preventing companies from holding stocks, but it didn't work because businesses gave their stocks to trustees. And there was also a huge power struggle between labor and business, where strikes took place, but they were not effective because businesses knew how to control them. So, for example, in the Haymarket and Pullman strikes, it didn't work because, in the end, the unions fell apart.
After that, we went into, the U.S. started doing more imperialism. And we see with foreign policy here that the U.S. is they're going from being more isolationist to actually trying to take control of territory. But eventually they'll shift to more just trying to influence other countries. But with imperialism, they're trying to take control of territory. Up until now, with the Monroe Doctrine, the U.S. said, oh, we're the sole defender of the Western Hemisphere, but we're not going to really take over the Western Hemisphere. But we started following the UK a little bit, where McKinley wins the Spanish-American War and then lets Congress decide what will be Cuba's fate. He promised independence, but he's not sure anymore. And with the Platt Amendment, Congress decides the U.S. has control of Cuba. And then McKinley actually wins the Philippines as well later. Now, Albert J. Beveridge was pro-imperialism, and he defended it by saying that America knows how to properly do democracy. Quote, administration of good government is not denial of liberty, quote, end quote. While George Hoare, he was against imperialism, where he felt that if we govern tyranny from afar, America at home will get despotic too, quote. So we're seeing almost, this will be echoed later with Martin Luther King and the Civil Rights era, where King will say, injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere, where if some people, he'll say that injustice in the South is injustice in the North as well. Now, Teddy Roosevelt also practiced imperialism in Panama, Venezuela, and China, Japan, and Russia, where he acted like he helped Panama separate from Colombia in order to build the Panama Canal. He got Venezuela to pay back their debts to Europe, and he got Japan and Russia to settle who got where in China. So the U.S. is acting like a mediator for these other countries, and we're shifting a little bit away from imperialism, but the U.S. is still being strong. Taft did similar things with his dollar diplomacy by giving money to Latin America, but Wilson was against imperialism, which transitions into
the Progressive Era. And during the Progressive Era, there was a lot going on because we were about to enter World War I, and what was going on, too, it caused issues because behind what was going on in World War I, there was struggles with women's rights, or just simply the women's voting rights. And what was going on, there was the National Women's Party, which was filled with younger women and run by Alice Paul, who was the leader of that party. But then there was also the National American Women's Suffrage Association, which was just older women who were more patient, and they were just also very married. And what compared to that was that the National Women's Party was younger and they were independent, really. And what happened was the World War I came, and Wilson was under the pressure of war going on, but these women used a nonviolent way of protesting in front of the White House, which caused a lot of controversy and it showed disrespect. And that showed them they had delayed their process in getting their Simple Voting Rights Act going on. So yeah, and that's what happened during the Progressive Era.
Yeah, and then in the 20s, there was, after the war, the government kind of took their hands off at home by cutting taxes and raising interest rates, and this let businesses expand, and then prices lowered because production increased, and people could afford consumer products like cars and houses that they couldn't afford, but nonetheless, not everyone was rich, not everyone could afford them. So a lot of credit was taken out for these things because people saw everyone else had a house and a car. So as we'll talk about, this was really bad for the economy.
Yeah, and what Crystal is saying about the economy during this time period, it led to the Great Depression. And so you see a lot of people losing all the savings that they had, and the unemployment rate just increasing. And it was due a lot in part to Harding and Coolidge taking that laissez-faire approach to regulating business. And so they let companies be made up, and the stock market was very much unregulated. And because of that, consumers kind of fell hard on hard times. And when FDR came to be president, a lot of people had been asking for government intervention, and he heard that and he took note, and with that he created the New Deal, and he just wanted to help the economy and provide more work opportunities for people who were suffering during that time period. So you see this lack of regulation transform into this kind of so-called boom, but then it leads to the consumers being hurt and citizens being hurt and the need for government intervention.
Yeah, and he followed more with the second New Deal. So we're seeing ways to solve, ways to get more involved economically also affects domestically. Now we're going to have a weather break.
Yes. Today we have a high of interest rates and a low of taxes. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, that's the weather, guys.
Okay, moving on to the past. We're getting past World War II into the beginning of the Cold War. Now, the Cold War will go for a very long time, but we'll see that first with the Korean War. North Korea was communist, and the USSR kind of wanted South Korea. And so we get into a conflict where the U.S. gets involved, and we start defending back against North Korea. But then China gets involved and we're pushed back. And so we don't really win. And people want the U.S. to leave North Korea. But MacArthur kind of still wants us to stay. And he was a big figure, and he worked under Truman. And he actually would go against what Truman wanted and what the people wanted. But people loved MacArthur because he was a war hero. And so when Truman eventually fired him, it actually hurt Truman's reputation. So we're seeing that what presidents do abroad actually affects them domestically. Now, Truman didn't want to do large threats. He went with a slow and steady approach. That's what he did in Korea. Eisenhower used brinkmanship. For example, with the Suez Canal, the U.S. was going to fund the Suez Canal for Egypt until it turns out Egypt was working with the USSR. And then when the UK said that they could fund the Suez Canal, Eisenhower said, "Oh, we retaliate with nuclear weapons." It was massive retaliation. And this approach was used for a while, but when we're seeing with both the slow and steady and massive retaliation that we're not trying to take over, we're just trying to influence and put democracy in places. And that will still be the case with Vietnam, where we're not trying to capture Vietnam, we're just trying to make them more like us, which is in a way similar to imperialism. Now, moving on to the 60s.
And during the 60s, we also had our own situations back at home. We started realizing that there was just an unfair going on with colored versus white people, how they were treated. And what we noticed was the best way, the most effective way to bring change to that issue was a nonviolent protest. Well, nonviolently protest what was going on. And we saw this with the Montgomery bus boycott that lasted 381 days. And an important figure that came out of that time was Rosa Parks. She started the boycott. And then we saw the sit-in movement where there was 89 students in a restaurant, and were arrested due to that because they were in an all-white restaurant, and what happened was they chose jail time rather than bail, and that led to actually Tennessee being the first place to let colored and white people eat together. And then we just go on to the Freedom Riders, and then we had the University of Mississippi and Alabama, where actually in University of Mississippi, James Meredith, an black Air Force veteran, wanted to attend an all-white university. And people protested his enrollment. But then we also saw that big March of Washington, which in huge international gathering. Wow. And it had everyone, and it also showed just a big power throughout with people, and it showed change. It could happen nonviolently, and that's what we saw also back in the 20s with the woman in the Progressive Era. But in contrast, even though majority of the civil rights movement was nonviolent, there was also the Black Power movement, which contrasted that. There was violent. They used the strategy of violent, which would involve riots and getting involved with the police, and vandalism, and etc. They wanted to protest economic and social inequality, and didn't believe that nonviolent marches and protests were effective enough. They thought if they did it violently, they would actually get somewhere. And overall, it was held the ideology of Malcolm X with that he took the trip with Mecca and saw people of different races in different walks of life praying together, and so then that happened, and then the FBI ended up undermining many of these black organizations, such as Black Panther Party.
And interestingly, the Black Panther Party did a lot of things domestically as well, so these social movements can also affect what kind of programs are available for the people.
And kind of a prequel to that whole Black Panther Party movement was, well, in the 60s. You see all these people fighting for civil rights, and it wasn't until Lyndon B. Johnson took office that their fight kind of had their first victory, which was with the Civil Rights Act, which he was able to pass through his Great Society, which, much like the New Deal and the Second New Deal, tried to help people out, and not only help people out, but kind of set forth regulations, set acts, so that they, in the future, would still be able to have their rights. And so, through the Great Society, Lyndon B. Johnson was able to kind of help society with the Civil Rights Act, and through education as well, but also to help consumers, such as with the truth in packaging requirements, and also help just people be able to enter the United States. So it's kind of demolishing that whole quota where non-white immigrants weren't able to enter the U.S. at a rate such as white immigrants were able to. And so you kind of see that the government is being able to kind of implement themselves in people's lives for the better in this case, and this it's through the process of a great boom or a decline in the economy that you kind of see these changes being made.
Oh my gosh, Crystal, there's not much time left. Let's speak to the 70s and 80s.
Anyway, we'll wrap it up with the 70s and 80s, where the government was, like Nara said, a lot more active in the economy, like in the 60s with the Great Society. They had these environmental regulations, like the Clean Air and Water Act, and the government was also trying to control oil prices to make them affordable, because they were just skyrocketing at this point. And when Reagan came in office, he took steps to solve the crisis of inflation and unemployment at the same time. So he spent a lot of money on the military, and he decreased regulation by a little bit by lowering the taxes, income taxes by 25%, and also lowering interest rates. But generally, the government at this point in time was very used to having more regulation on business.
Okay. All right, guys, thank you for listening. And so, yeah, it looks like it's almost...
Oh my god! It's done!
We
I'm
survived.
so glad we lived.
I know. So as you can see, we're having some technical difficulties. We are no longer in the actual studio because as you saw before.
But thank God the world didn't end. Now we can think about the future, you know?
Exactly, yeah.
Exactly.
So yeah, we can talk about how economic policy from back then really affected us today, and it really does because all those regulations that they came up with in the 70s and 80s, those environmental regulations, they're still in effect, and there have been new ones created like the Oil Pollution Act and the Energy Policy Act that really just help further conserve the environment. And there have also been more government regulation on business itself, like more taxes, like the progressive tax bracket was introduced very recently, and there's also been more regulation and concern over health. So basically, pressure on tobacco companies, on drug companies.
And we're also seeing this similar themes with foreign policy back then influenced today, where foreign policy kind of changes as domestic policy changes. So back then, as a society, like in the imperialism era, as society became subjugating people, where we had the women's rights movement, so did our foreign policy. And so today we're seeing that as people really need jobs because the job market's changing and there's less blue-collar worker jobs. We're being more focused on ourselves rather than allowing immigration and helping other countries and withdraw wars.
Yeah, I definitely agree with your thought about how we're more focused on domestic policies right now, just because we've been talking a lot more about like gun control in the United States, as well as decriminalizing certain drugs such as marijuana, which different states have decriminalized it, and also kind of having term limits on how long Congress members and members of the Supreme Court can serve, which is kind of going back to when FDR initiated the New Deal and the second New Deal, where he just wanted to add 6 more justices to further increase like his ability to do things. But now we kind of see the need to reduce age limit, like produce age restrictions for justices, because it's kind of different generations have their different laws that they want to pass.
And yeah, also talking about minority groups, today we're still struggling with minorities getting the equality that they deserve. As we see today, we have the Black Lives Matter movement that is fighting for specifically black people that have been mistreated, specifically or most of the time by police and etc. And then there's also recently the abortion law that's been passed in Alabama, which is talking about how they're not letting women have control over their own body, and that's a very serious controversial thing because in the Constitution they're talking about how church and state is separate, but the people that have voted are talking about their reasonings are because of religion reasons, and that is causing a lot of controversy. And so overall, a lot of minority groups such as women, the LGBTQ plus community, and the black community are all struggling to just fight and get more equal rights because they're still being mistreated today. Even though thankfully we're accepting them, we're fine, it's still a struggle.
All right, everyone. Thank you for watching the Highlights of Life. Bye.
See you in the next episode. Woo!